In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. I think many of us feel very familiar with the stories that we hear in the Gospel as it's read Sunday after Sunday and also in our own reading. I think in that we get something of what Jesus values and what his message is. But I think we also have a sense we'd like to learn something about just what did he look like? Or what were his mannerisms? Or what kind of a personality did he have? And I think like that, we have a feeling we'd like to just get him into a little better focus. And we wish the Gospels would tell us more about that. And yet they don't. Now I think one way of understanding their silence on these points is that what Jesus looked like, his mannerisms, his personality. I think it's something that it takes the saints to let us know. Jesus came into the world, and he is the light of the world. But that light of the world, that is Jesus, has shown itself to us in 1,000 different faces, 1,000 different mannerisms, and 1,000 different personalities. And we could also say, beyond the fact that he was part of that Judaic culture, we find that in some way he must be incarnate in other cultures, and even in our own. And even in that culture that we could call the Georgetown culture, and the culture of our own families and friends. We can look back and see the saints who somehow or another could shape their culture by what they presented. And we can think of somebody like St. Beccaria and her whole vision of what religious life should be and what an immense influence that had. We can think of it something like St. Augustine, and St. Augustine and his passionate preaching, and how that did so much to shape the European Middle Ages. We can think of it in terms of St. Francis and that love for nature that Francis brought to the world in such a strange and beautiful way. We can think of it in St. Ignatius and St. Ignatius in the Renaissance. And he was able to present something of those Christian values, that basic Christian gospel message. He could present it to that Renaissance culture that almost became pagan. I think we can think of saints more in our own time, like Mother Teresa. And she had just some way of speaking to the modern world. And yet, in a sense, we get Mother Teresa was just very much herself. And yet, in her being very much herself, there was something more that she had about her. And how the world, again, with that tendency to move into some kind of pagan forgetfulness, could suddenly become aware of the light of Christ. The light of Christ has come into the world in 1,000 faces, 1,000 mannerisms. Now that light of Christ is the saints and you. You are called to be a saint. That is, for Christ to have his completion, it needs your personality, your features, your hands. It's the one great light that has come into this world. And that light must in some way shine in our culture. I mentioned the saints, and they're the great figures. They're the great figures in sort of heroic stature that we can hear of them and feel that we could never be quite like them. Well, we shouldn't be. We should be very much ourselves. St. Paul writes about Christ. He says, I live now not I, but Christ lives in me. And Christ lived in St. Paul. And yet St. Paul had his own personality. He had his own foibles. He had his own weaknesses. And yet Christ was in him, and those who knew him knew that they had seen the light. We can ask ourselves, in our own time, what can we contribute? And we could ask ourselves, could I contribute the light of Christ today? It's going to be in a very different culture than the culture in which Jesus was bred. And yet, it's a culture in need of light. Could I bring my hands, my features, my personality? Could I be a saint? Could I know something of what St. Paul said when he said, I live now not I, but Christ lives in me? And St. Paul would go on to say about Christ reaching his completion, the pleroma, the fullness. For that to happen, it takes you. Beyond all the other things that you feel you want to do in your life, could you bring light into a troubled world? The light has come into the world. And each one of us is to be a bearer of light. Among those thousands and thousands of faces, yours has a place. You are needed. The light. Let it come into your world on this, the feast of all saints.